Welcome to the 2050 Rural and Human Service Transportation Plans Regional Workshop, focusing on Southern Georgia. My name is Matthew Wilson. I serve as the Mobility Manager for the Georgia Department of Transportation and as the Project Manager for this plan. And I want to thank you all for attending this afternoon. Just a few virtual meeting housekeeping items. First, we ask that you please keep your mic on mute during the presentation. This ensures that everyone is able to hear the presentation clearly. For those using a computer or smartphone, this is the microphone icon with a slash through it. For those on the phone, we ask that you please mute your phone. As we progress through the presentation, we have scheduled breaks for questions and discussion. Please ask or provide a comment. This workshop is designed for us to better understand rural and human service transportation in your region, and your active participation is encouraged. When asking a question or making a comment during these times, please use the raised hand feature in Teams. This is the icon with the smiley face and hand. Alternatively, you can use the chat box feature to type in your question, which is the comment bubble icon. Our team member Jaquita will be monitoring the hand raises and chat box during the entire workshop. If you're on a phone calling in, you will be unable to raise your hand or use the chat box. So during these discussion segments, we will ask if anyone on the phone would like to speak. Please unmute your phone and begin speaking. The 2050 Rural and Human Services Transportation Plan is a 3-agency plan. I will speak more about this in the coming slides. The Georgia Departments of Transportation, Human Services, and Community Health are the plan sponsors, and the plan is being developed with the help of a consultant team comprised of AECOM, Cambridge Systematics, and Modern Mobility partners. Today, we're going to run through the following topics. I will provide a brief introduction and some background on rural and human service transportation in Georgia. I will then hand it off to Will Brewer from AECOM to review the available transit and transportation services in the Southern Georgia region. After, Baird Bream from Cambridge Systematics will walk us through the region's transit needs, and then Kirsten Moat from Modern Mobility Partners will guide our discussion session. We will also have a couple question and discussion points throughout the workshop today. So what exactly is rural and human service transportation? Not many people may be familiar with the terms. Rural and Human Service Transportation, or RHST, are mobility services provided for the benefit of disadvantaged populations, including persons with disabilities, older adults, and persons without vehicles. RHST includes services provided by public transit operators, human service agencies, private providers, and private nonprofit agencies. This 2050 RHST plan seeks to do a few things. First, we're going to update the existing conditions information from the previous plan. Then we are going to build upon the recommendations and efforts completed from the first plan to identify projects, programs, and policies to meet current and future demands and provide enhancements to RHST services across Georgia. I mentioned that this plan is a 3-agency plan. This is because the state of Georgia administers 3 systems to provide public transit, human services transportation, and non-emergency medical transportation, or NEMT. Each system is administered by a different state agency using different funding sources. Gdot focuses on public transit for rural and small urban populations. DHS focuses on transportation services for seniors, low-income families, individual disabilities, and vocational training, while DCH focuses on transportation to medically necessary services for eligible Medicaid members. Coordination exists at the state, regional, and local levels. However, each agency system operates independently using a variety of service delivery models with differing requirements. The state's role in governing transit is primarily to oversee compliance with federal grant requirements. There is no single state authority to set up priorities for public transit and human services transportation, or to coordinate planning and funding of transit services for rural communities. A little bit of history on the RHST plan. Back in 2007, the Georgia Departments of Human Services and Transportation completed the Coordinated Public Transit Human Services Transportation Plan. As an update to the plan, Gdot initiated the Georgia Rural and Human Services Transportation Plan 2.0 in 2011. The RHST Plan 2.0 outlined coordination activities among the rural public and human services transportation providers across the state to achieve improved service delivery for the state's public transportation and human services transportation customers. The plan also developed recommendations to implement mobility management at the state and regional level. In 2021, Gdot, DHS, and DCH began developing and update the 2050 Georgia RHST plan. The purpose of this plan is to provide a framework for additional coordination among Georgia's agencies impacted by mobility services and continue the work of the Technical Coordinating Group, which is now renamed the Technical Advisory Group, and expand its participation to additional stakeholders. A quick look at our plan schedule. You can see we've wrapped up our vision and goals, which I will discuss on the next slide, and you're heavy into our existing conditions and needs assessment and beginning our alternatives analysis. What I want to focus on today is how to get people involved in this process and how we can get input from your region to help us understand needs and develop solutions. The stars on the schedule indicate stakeholder and public outreach events, and those with a pink circle indicate the technical advisory group meetings. Outreach is a key component of the RHST plan update and ensures that agencies updating the plan fully understand the rural and human service transportation needs across the state. The Technical Advisory Group, which includes the 3 state agencies sponsoring the plan, also includes representatives from regional commissions, the Statewide Independent Living Council of Georgia, and other stakeholders identified during our stakeholder engagement process. I'm really pleased to see a few of them attending the workshop this afternoon. We are engaging stakeholders and the public in each of the 12 regions in Georgia through these regional workshops. We are also conducting a statewide survey of RHST providers and a separate survey for riders, the link to which is on the QR code on the slide. These efforts will provide all Georgians an opportunity to assess the status of the RHST plan update and identify key needs and service coordination strategies. Additionally, public feedback will be elicited during the 30-day public review and comment period for the draft RHST plan update, which we are targeting for July. The RHST vision and goals are structured from the statewide transit plan. Our vision statement outlines where we would like rural and human service transportation to be in 2050, which is to continue and grow statewide rural and human service transportation coordination to improve the quality of life and economic activities for all Georgians, specifically those in rural areas, those with disabilities, older adults, and persons without vehicles. Our 6 goals, again based on the statewide transit plan, outline how we seek to implement the vision. The first goal is to provide coordinated and efficient rural and human services transportation. The second is to provide a safe and sustainable RHST network. The third is to optimize public transit programs to best meet public transit systems and travelers' needs. The fourth is to ensure public transit coverage across the state to support mobility and access for all. The fifth is to connect rural transit to regional and urban centers. And finally, the sixth is to leverage technology and innovation to support public transit ridership and performance. I'd now like to hand it over to Will Brewer from AECOM to walk us through the available transit in the Southern Georgia region. Will?
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. So I'd like to just briefly take you through the existing public transit services and systems that exist in the Southern region, just a brief snapshot, and that will include public transit, Department of Human Services, and Department of Community Health. So in the Southern region, 15 out of the 18 counties are serviced by rural on-demand transit. I will acknowledge that Lowndes County does have both urban and rural. That'd be for the city of Valdosta and Lowndes County. That's highlighted there in pink for those of you who can see on the screen. And I'd like to also acknowledge that 3 other counties in the region do not have any public transit based on our research. That'd be Clinch County, Eccles, Lanier. And I will note some of these counties that do offer public transit are relatively recent, and we can talk about that later on. Moving on to Department of Human Services, there are a few different organizations that are involved, and you're very well covered in your region. That'd be the Division of Aging, the Department of Family and Children Services, and the Department of, have it right here, the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities. That's well covered around your region. Lastly, for the Department of Community Health, we have non-emergency medical trips. There are 2 brokers that operate throughout the entire state in 5 different regions. As you can see in the screen, or if you're listening, there are 2 regions that encompass your region, and that would be Southwest and East region, both of which are serviced by the broker Motive Care. So that's your snapshot for your region, and I'm going to hand it over to Kirsten so we can talk about anything we're missing.
Great, thanks, Will. Yeah, so this is the first kind of scheduled break where we want to get some feedback from you. And we have a polling exercise if you'd like to participate. If you have a computer or smartphone available, you can join us either by scanning the QR code that's on the screen, or you can join it through the website www.menti.com. That's MENTI.com. Once you get to the landing page, it will ask you for a code. That code is also on the screen. It is 87908580. That code will remain at the top of the screen once we get into the questions. If you do not have computer access or a smartphone available, I'm going to read the questions verbally. Especially if you're on the phone, please feel free to unmute yourself and respond verbally. Alternatively, if you do not use the menti.com website, you can also raise your hand or use the chat box to respond to the questions. So first question, I'm going to go back to the maps that Will did the overview on so we can reference them. But we want to make sure, A, that everything we're showing on these maps is in fact correct and that we don't have any missing information and we're not misrepresenting information on those maps. We also want to know if there are other services that currently exist that we are not capturing in these maps. So what I mean by that is there may be transportation services provided by private organizations or maybe nonprofit organizations that service a particular group of people. One example may be a faith-based organization that's providing transportation for their congregation seniors to either senior centers or for errands. If you are aware of any type of transportation services that are offered like that, we would like to know those. So let me go back to the map so we can reference it. So as Will mentioned, on the public transit side, so this is public transit available to anyone. We show that there are 3 counties in this region that are currently not operating any public transit service. That is Lanier County, Clinch County, and Eccles County. We also indicate that Lowndes County offers both rural transit throughout the county, but also urban transit in the city of Valdosta. The remaining counties in this region do offer rural on-demand transit. On the human services side, we're showing that all of the counties in this region have senior transportation services, family and children health services, and behavioral health and developmental disability transportation services. And also the entire region is covered by non-emergency medical transportation offered through the Department of Community Health. That service is offered through the Motive Care broker, but this county is broken into 2 of the DCH regions, the Southwest region and the East region. I'm going to go back to our questions, see if we have any responses. Oh, we do. Great. Okay. What are we missing? So the first response is employer-based van pools and faith-based employment/educational van pools. So if I'm to understand correctly, and if you made that comment, feel free to unmute yourself and chime in. There are existing employer-based van pools that exist. That might be an employer who is operating a van pool service for their employees, and there are currently faith-based transportation services providing transportation to employment and education. Is that correct? Other responses are, I'm not aware of any missed transportation services, so thank you. And 2 not applicable responses. So yeah, if you provided the response about the employer-based and the faith-based van pools, If you have an opportunity to put into the chat box some additional information about those, or mine and Matthew's contact information is going to be at the end of this presentation. We would love to get more information on what those are and where they service so that we can reflect those in our existing conditions. I'm going to move on to the next question. So thinking about the existing transportation services that are out there today, either as a provider, as a rider, or maybe somebody who works in one of the support services and you have customers who need these transportation, what are some of the constraints that you're seeing on this existing system? So a couple examples of this, maybe the system doesn't operate all of the days of the week. Maybe it only operates Monday through Friday, but it could really benefit if there were transportation services on Saturday and Sunday. Maybe a different constraint is the transportation services are only offered from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. And perhaps you have third shift workers in this region, whether it's in industrial, manufacturing, distribution, and warehousing, that need transportation services in the overnight hours for their employment, but they cannot get to those because the hours of operation are only from 8 to 6. Other constraints, obviously, the big elephant in the room is always funding. That's always a constraint. We need more funding. Other constraints may include labor shortages, driver shortages. We've heard that a lot across the other regions. That's a major pinch point for people, or just personnel in general. Maybe it's front office people. Other constraints could include things like NTD reporting might be a big constraint for you. Maybe you don't have the manpower to stay on top of the reporting. Maybe you have a big issue with cancellation of trips and being charged with those trip cancellations. So feel free to enter your thoughts on the Mentimeter. Feel free to raise your hand or enter your comments into the chat box. If you're on the phone and you have some thoughts around this, please feel free to unmute yourself and speak up. Someone did post that they agree that the availability during non-standard hours would greatly benefit some sectors of employment. So there's some demand out there for employment trips that are not being met due to the service hours. Another person put in driver shortages. Again, we're seeing that across the state, and Baird's actually going to talk a little bit more about that when he gets into some of our preliminary survey results. The requirement to book trips 24 hours in advance is a constraint because a lot of people want to book trips within a few hours. I think that's a great point. A lot of these do require in advance reservations. But that doesn't always work for everybody. People don't know 24 hours in advance that they need to go somewhere or that they need a ride. And so this idea of demand response in real time is a trend. And I'll say that in some of the other regions, they would really like to see more flexibility in their service and maybe even some micro mobility service options where as soon as somebody requests a trip, a driver is alerted and can go pick them up in real time. Someone else said, I would second that driver shortage issue. I'm gonna ask a follow-up about the driver shortage. Do you feel that if you could pay higher wages or provide more fringe benefits to your drivers, that this would be less of an issue? Do you feel like it's a wage or monetary constraint? give you a minute to respond to that question. Again, my question is, the driver shortage, is it a wage issue? Is it a monetary issue of why you have a shortage? You just cannot pay competitive wages. Someone said, yes, wages have a negative impact on the driver shortage. Thank you. I appreciate that. Any other comments or questions that you want to bring up at this time? Thank you very much for participating in the polling exercise. Those are the only polling questions I have for you, so you can exit out of those. We will have more discussion opportunities later in this presentation. It's going to be discussion based, so we will focus on the raise hand, the chat box, and unmuting your mics. Before I move on, somebody else said many drivers can drive for other companies and do not need to meet the requirements to drive transit, and they get more money. So that's a great point. It's not necessarily, they can get more money from those other companies and they don't have to meet all the requirements they do for public transit. So those are the types of things that we want to hear. We want to hear what those issues are, see if we can find some projects, programs, or policies to help alleviate those stresses. Okay, feel free to keep your comments coming in the chat box. You can raise your hand if you have a question, and Jaquita will interrupt us and we can answer your question. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Baird Breen with Cambridge Systematics. He and his team have been working on the needs assessment for this study, and he's going to present some of the preliminary findings of our quantitative and qualitative needs assessment. So Baird?
Thank you very much, Kirsten. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for your time and your input today. We're happy to share some of our preliminary findings from the needs assessment with you. So to start, just introducing what the needs assessment methodology consists of. Our needs assessment methodology is designed to align with the methodology that Gdot used for its statewide transit plan in 2019. This allows us to compare the results of our analysis to those previous ones and see what has changed, see if there are any kind of initial lessons learned from that comparison alone. And both of these methodologies are based on a methodology recommended by the Transit Cooperative Research Program, which is a national research center for transit planners in the transportation sector. It's a methodology that has been used nationwide, has been used repeatedly since its release in the mid-2010s. And so we're glad to be using this methodology. It's seen as very robust, very reliable, and we're happy we stand behind the results that we're seeing so far. Next slide, please. So the way that methodology is executed is through two main types of analysis. The non-program demand assessment, which is highlighted in the blue columns in this table, and the mobility gap demand assessment, which is highlighted in the green columns in this table. And what both of these assessments do is they analyze transit demand at the county level and aggregate that into a regional demand assessment using different types of demographic data. The demographic data specifically used focuses on populations that are transit dependent or transit reliant, and so are likely to drive that transit demand. So for the non-program demand assessment, these demographics include people who are ages 60 and older, people with disabilities, and residents of zero vehicle households, by which we mean people who live in households where they lack ready and reliable access to a private vehicle. The mobility gap demand assessment takes a similar approach, but focuses a little bit more on the trip behavior and trip demand of a specific demographic group, namely those who live in zero vehicle households. And the mobility gap demand assessment actually compares the difference in travel behavior between people who live in one vehicle households and people who live in zero vehicle households to actually measure essentially what number of trips aren't being taken due to that lack of access to a private vehicle. The data in both of these data sets is coming from the American Community Survey, which is performed every year by the U.S. Census Bureau. Now, even though the data is performed every year, the Census Bureau still needs to kind of clean that data, organize it, and make it ready for public consumption. So there's a lag in data release. As a result, at the time we started our analysis, the most recent data set available was 2019, and that formed the basis of our analysis. We aligned that data with transit data that the different transit providers in the region have prepared for the National Transit Database, also taken from 2019, so that we've got a same year comparison for our base year. We then use a long-range horizon year of 2050 that allows us to see how demand will change over time and essentially project whether demand will grow or shrink. Using these two types of information, we estimate an aggregated rural transit trip demand across all counties and all rural areas in those counties within the Southern Georgia region. And we compare that against the number of existing rural transit trips provided by all transit providers within the region. So what we see is that in 2019, all the rural and human service transportation providers in Georgia provided about 123,000 trips. We compare that against an estimated rural transit trip demand under the non-program demand method of about 172,000 and an aggregated rural transit trip demand of just above 800,000 under the mobility gap demand assessment. Now, to clarify, we use these two methodologies to end up at that result, to see a spectrum of demand. This just helps us understand, a range of potential outcomes for transit service provision for rural and human services transportation. What we then do with that estimated rural transit trip demand is compare it against the existing number of rural transit trips provided to estimate a rural transit trip demand gap. And we see that ranges from about 48,000 under the non-program demand assessment all the way to 678,000 under the mobility gap demand assessment. The final row in this table then shows the total annual costs associated with meeting 100% of that rural transit trip demand, and that's both capital and operating costs. So to meet all 172,000 trips under the non-program demand assessment would require capital and operating costs of about $4.6 million per year. And to meet all 800,000 trips under the mobility gap demand assessment would require $23 million. Now, those numbers may seem like a lot, and that is very much by design. This is a maximalist approach to estimating the costs associated with meeting 100% of that demand. It's not a recommendation. It's not the assumed level of expenditures needed that we're moving forward with. It's just helping us understand what level of resources would be necessary to, again, meet 100% of demand. Looking to 2050, we see how demand changes over time. And to clarify, those 2050 numbers are taken from population projections that are produced by the Georgia Governor's Office of Planning and Budget, which produces county-level population projections for every year between 2020 and 2065. And what we see is that this region is projected to grow slightly, so transit demand is going to increase during that time, growing from about 171,000 to just under 180,000 under the non-program demand assessment model, and growing from 800,000 to 857,000 under the mobility gap demand assessment model. This means that total annual costs, again, both capital and operating, that are necessary to meet 100% of demand range from $5.4 million to $25.6 million. Again, just showing us how much would be needed to meet 100% of demand in 2050. If we go on to the next slide, we'll talk about the other type of quantitative demand assessment used to evaluate transit. And you'll see that this table is blank, and I'll explain why. So the other type of transit demand assessment that we conduct is a demand of specifically commuter transit, namely transit that crosses county lines so that people can go from where they work, people can go from where they live to where they work. This is essentially a recognition of the economic relationships between different counties within the region, whereas the previous types of transit demand analysis focused more on travel within the county to meet all types of travel demand, going to work, going to the hospital, going to a doctor's appointment, going grocery shopping. This now focuses on cross-county travel in order specifically to go to work. And it's based on a proxy estimate of transit demand in the form of home-based work trips, essentially people who are working from home. And the reason we use this as a proxy demand is that home-based work trips represent work trips that are not being met by another type of transit, another type of transportation in general. So it's essentially saying if someone, works at home, they may choose to work at home because their commute is too long or too arduous. But if they knew that a commuter transit option were available in order to get to work, they would take it. This data is taken from a similar combination of sources, both another U.S. Census Bureau database and the Gdot travel demand model, which is a tool that Gdot uses across the state to analyze travel behavior and estimate travel patterns. And we conduct this estimate in both 2019 and 2050 in order to see how demand changes over time. Now, again, you'll see this table is blank, and that's because we're using a specific threshold value of 100,000 commuter transit trips per year, essentially treating that as a minimum level of demand that's necessary to justify and sustain the costs of a commuter transit service. So while we recognize that every county has some degree of interaction with, its surrounding counties or even across regional lines as people move into other economic centers, we still set that minimum threshold to essentially say there is sufficient demand to merit further exploration of commuter transit service. And what we find in our analysis of the Southern Georgia region is that there are no kind of cross-county corridors that meet that minimum threshold. Again, it doesn't mean that there is no demand for commuter transit or that commuter transit could not play a role in this community. It's just that the level of demand is not meeting the level we deem sufficient for that degree of investment for a statewide plan. So I will pause there because that concludes the quantitative components of the needs assessment, and just see if there are any reactions, feedback, questions.
Yep, and I can go back a slide if anybody wants to look back at those numbers. What questions do you have? All of that seem in line with your everyday experience in this region?
Yeah, this is Corey Hall with the Southern Georgia Regional Commission. I would say that the numbers that you presented for 2019 are very much in line with what is currently happening or happened in 2019, and as we recover from COVID is looking to happen here in the coming year.
Okay.
So those look very, very accurate.
Okay, thanks, Corey.
Thank you. Very glad to hear that.
Okay, Barrett, you want to move on to the qualitative?
Absolutely. And we'll be discussing that kind of post-COVID recovery thinking as we get through some of these survey results. So the qualitative component of the needs assessment focuses on the provider survey and the rider survey that Matt mentioned earlier. These are surveys that we have distributed directly to our stakeholders in order to get their perspective and feedback on needs, priorities, and challenges with rural and human services transportation throughout the state. To state up front, both surveys are still open through the end of the month. If you've already taken the provider survey, we thank you for your participation. If not, it's again still open. And either way, we encourage you to share the survey with your peers and colleagues as well. So to dive right in, we've received 36 responses to date on the provider survey, and we're very pleased with that level of response. Slightly fewer than 50% of respondents are able to carry riders to destinations outside their jurisdictional boundaries, and nearly 66% of respondents have not pursued coordinated human services transportation or regional service, which we understand. You know, we recognize that these are small agencies working with, you know, often working with small staff, and regional service represents a significant, you know, step up in terms of coordination responsibilities, administrative responsibilities, and it's challenging to do that. And we commend SGRT for the work that they've done in getting that coordinated system up and running. It's not easy. We also heard that many agencies have reported less ridership in 2020 than in 2019. Specifically, 6 respondents had fewer than 5,000 trips in 2019, but this had increased to 10 for 2020. Not surprised to see this at all. You know, there's recognition that COVID had a dramatic impact on, you know, the transit sector as a whole. Agencies across the country have lost a significant amount of ridership. And, you know, this can be attributable to a number of causes, everything from the economic disruptions where people lost their jobs, to the, you know, the shutdowns that kept people from going out to eat, or, you know, going to the hospital for non-essential or non-emergency services. It, you know, it disrupted travel patterns. And then tragically, it also, you know, simply caused a lot of loss of life, COVID-19. And as a result, you know, some of these agencies may have just lost some of their ridership base. We're trying to keep this in mind as we think about our strategies and recommendations in this plan, that, you know, a lot of these agencies are essentially starting on their back foot and still going through a recovery period. But when we think about recovery, we have been heartened to see what some of these agencies are thinking about when they look to their future. We asked agencies to indicate what sort of technologies they either are currently using or are considering using. And while 2 respondents indicate that they currently use a smartphone app or website for trip planning and fare payment, 8 agencies are considering adopting this tool. It's great to see that they're thinking about taking a kind of technology-centered approach to their services as they move forward. I mean, when we heard the concern voiced earlier in this workshop about how people want to be able to book trips within a few hours as opposed to within, you know, 24 hours notice, these types of trip planning software solutions have played a really valuable role in making that sort of more immediate trip request process available. So again, it's great to see that agencies are thinking about ways they can improve the quality of service and the accessibility of that service for their customers. The most common state of good repair need identified is purchasing new vehicles, which is a perennial challenge for small rural and human services transportation providers. You know, is getting the necessary capital funding and executing the procurement in order to get those new vehicles. But interestingly enough, the second highest state of good repair need that we heard from respondents is establishing regular maintenance schedules for their vehicles. And in the open-ended responses, what some of those providers indicated is that they share their maintenance staff with other transit providers in the region or with other, you know, county governments, municipal governments. And as a result, they're not able to schedule their maintenance when they want to, but rather when the workforce becomes available to them, which limits their ability to, you know, execute that maintenance and get those vehicles back into service and maintain that reliability for their riders. And that seems to overlap with a general concern that Kirsten already brought up earlier during our open discussion, which is attracting and retaining qualified personnel. This was the single most frequently indicated administrative challenge among survey respondents, which really speaks to, again, the kind of workforce impacts that COVID-19 has had, that it's harder to find work. A lot of people have left their jobs either to, take care of family members under COVID, or there's just been more competition for the workforce. Most significantly, in an earlier workshop, we heard from some of the transit providers that their drivers have left their agencies not to do other driving work, like in freight or like courier services or limousine services, but instead to work for fast food restaurants, because those fast food restaurants have lost enough of their workforce that they're starting to pay higher wages, pay the most competitive wages in the area. And so, these transit agencies aren't just competing with other transportation providers, but really are competing with the entire economy in their region. So it really speaks to the difficulty of this moment. Beyond those administrative challenges, we also asked for respondents to give their feedback on rider demand and satisfaction challenges and funding challenges. And what we heard was that among rider demand and satisfaction, the challenge was expanding service into new markets to ensure that transit is able to go where people want to go, but then also dealing with the public perception of transit. The public perception of transit represents an interesting blend of traditional issues and emerging issues. Again, we recognize that rural and human services transportation often faces this challenge where people think that they can't use the service, or that the service isn't useful for them because it's a service designed for people with disabilities or designed for the elderly, and that's not necessarily the case. A lot of these rural services are open to the general public, and it's just a matter of doing that marketing and outreach effort to help people understand that. But unfortunately, there's also the more contemporary issue of, once again, due to COVID-19, that people see transit as unsafe. That if they, spend a lot of time in an enclosed vehicle next to other people, they may be exposing themselves to the risk of COVID. The evidence suggests that this isn't the case, but again, we're still dealing with that back foot, or dealing from the back foot as we come out of COVID, and have to work not only to let people know that transit is reliable, that it's affordable, accessible, but again, that it's safe. It doesn't represent a health risk. And finally, the main funding issue is securing local capital funding, which again, very common among rural and human service transit providers, that they're small agencies operating in smaller regions where the governments run pretty lean operations, and finding the money for those longer term capital investments can be a challenge to address. Moving on to our rider survey, we've received 55 responses to date. And again, we're glad to see that level of engagement, but we're definitely looking to grow this. So again, the survey's still open. We encourage you to share it with your constituents. Most notably, the thing we would like to see change is that 85% of our survey respondents indicate that they do not currently ride transit. Obviously, we're very glad to hear from people who don't currently use transit. It can help us understand what those barriers might be, or what the perception of transit might be. And frankly, it's just a good sign of interest and engagement that people who don't use a system nevertheless are interested in learning more about it and want to kind of share their opinion on it. But ultimately, of course, we do want to hear from our riders to make sure we're still providing that high quality of service. And so we'd like to see more riders participate and ultimately reach, closer to like a 50-50 split. Among those who do ride transit, their main reasons for riding is that they lack access to a vehicle, and their most common trip purposes are work, medical appointments, and dialysis appointments. And what you see there is, very time-sensitive trip types, even though they capture a broad array of trip purposes. This will be a common theme throughout the rider survey responses, that people are dealing with, time-sensitive trips, and really need their transit service to be consistent and reliable in order for them to, use it as a preferred method. If transit were not available and riders had to find an alternative, our respondents indicated that they would get a ride from a friend or a family member. Again, very common within rural and human services transportation that that transit is part of a set of mobility options that are used under different circumstances by the riders. But we recognize that, you know, relying on the social network is not always easy. It's not always convenient or seamless, and it creates costs for those people who, you know, the friends and the family members who are providing the transit. So really, we want to ensure that, you know, transit is reliable and consistent so that it can play as large a role in these mobility choices for our riders as possible. Among those who do not ride transit, the two most common reasons for doing so are that they are interested, but transit is not convenient, and unfortunately, that they are simply not interested, which again speaks to that need for the marketing and outreach so that we can help people understand what transit can do for them, how they can use it, how it can be a meaningful mobility option for them. Among those who do ride transit, their most frequently selected challenges for using it are that transit does not go where they want to go, the distance to the nearest transit service is too far, and it's not reliable enough for time-sensitive trips. And there we start to see the emergence of the challenge in rural and human services transportation that, you know, we're often serving a very large geographic area. And so we get into that coverage issue, but we also get into that reliability and timeliness issue of ensuring that service can be can take people to where they want to go, but then that they also can rely on it to be consistent for these time-sensitive trips. We asked respondents to indicate where they want transit providers to prioritize improvements, and again, basically the inverse of those challenges, where they want transit to ensure access to jobs, ensure access to healthcare, and connect different parts of the community or region. So once again, meeting time-sensitive trip purposes while also connecting different parts of the community or region and expanding that service coverage. I think we see some of those tensions attempted to be resolved when our respondents indicated what their most important transit technologies that they want to see transit providers prioritize. And that's the real-time arrival information at transit stops and the real-time arrival information available via smartphone, website, or text. So again, what we see here is they want that information to help them plan their trips, to know that when their vehicle is arriving so that they can plan accordingly and then have that greater consistency and reliability in transit service provision. So that concludes the overview of the qualitative survey results. We're going to open this up for discussion. But again, just one more reminder, the surveys are both open through the end of the month. We encourage you to take them, to share the surveys with your peers, colleagues, and constituents.
All right, thanks, Barry. So that concludes the presentation portion of this workshop. We want to leave the remaining time for discussions, comments, questions that you may have. We've got really good participation on this call this afternoon, so I'm hoping to hear from several of you, and it can be anything. This is your opportunity to gripe to us about what challenges you're facing, what obstacles you're facing. While you kind of think about those, I have some questions for you all, and it's just to kind of get you thinking about some of your challenges, what's going on, maybe some of your successes. And we're going to talk about that with your coordinated service here in a minute. But thinking about the service areas, oh, and this is just a reminder, raise your hand, comment box. If you're on the phone and you would like to make a comment or have a question, please just unmute yourself and feel free to interrupt me. So thinking about your service area, most of it's covered, but there are a couple counties that are not showing any service. I'm curious if any of those counties have shown any interest in starting transit service or joining the coordinated service. And alternatively, if they're not, does anybody on the call maybe know why? Hey, Corey.
Hey, Chris, I'll tackle that question for you. Some of our thoughts that we received from those counties, Lanier, Clinch, and Eccles, as we've had conversations with them in the past, is that when it comes to public transportation, there are very few services in those communities. And those individuals who would likely be using public transportation are going to be going to Valdosta, Waycross, other communities outside those counties to get those services.
Mm-hmm.
The cost to the public rider with our fare structure it makes those trips unaffordable. Truthfully, if they could afford a public trip, they could afford a vehicle. I mean, that's how expensive it is to do a public trip out of those communities.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is what is perceived, I guess, as the small number of strictly public riders that would utilize the services in those communities.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to the DHS coordinated services, a couple of those communities use those services quite often, and a pretty good number of them. Eccles County, with it being a very small population county, they aren't using many of the services anyhow. Just a very few numbers. One of the things we have thought, and we are, as SGRC Regional Transit is in conversations to look at becoming a Medicaid provider for transportation, that might help those communities. Further discussion about becoming a part of the regional transit program, because a lot of those individuals might be using Medicaid transportation to get to those essential medical appointments.
Mm-hmm.
But
Okay.
that's some background on those communities that I'm aware of.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And the reason I ask is, like, we don't want to just show, oh, these counties don't have public transit, yet our quantitative assessment says that there's a demand for it, and then make a recommendation that's in direct conflict with, kind of the background that you've been saying. Like, they don't have a high number of public riders. A lot of their riders may be eligible for these other services and are either getting those services and may get more service if you all become a provider for the non-emergency medical transit. So I don't want to just blanketly say, okay, if this county doesn't have transit, we're recommending that there be expanded 5311 service, if that really doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I think it would be you would have a very small number of riders if you look at just the strict definition of public transit service, 5311 service in those communities.
Yeah. Okay.
But I think we need to do a better job of communicating the value of the regional service to those communities and saying, hey, it's available. It would be available if you participate in this program. It's available for your residents, whether they use it or not. It's an option available for them, whether they use it or not. So.
Mm-hmm. But even if you have your regional service go in there, because of the trip lengths, like you said, that trip cost to the rider would be pretty expensive.
The trip cost to the rider for a public trip, yes. And when we're looking at costs in general for all the trips in rural areas, our costs are pretty high on a per trip basis.
Mm-hmm.
Compared to smaller regions, because there is just such a great distance to travel in the rural areas.
Yeah. And I don't want to just put you on the spot, Corey, because we've got lots of people on the call and I want to hear other people's thoughts as well. But thinking about workforce from a public trip perspective, Have you had any conversations or any thought about some sort of workforce transportation program that might be like a public-private partnership with some of the employers in the area?
Yeah, we've had a couple of conversations like that, but I would say if Elena Riles is on the call and she would want to chime in on that, she's been really working on that more so in her area.
Elena, I see you. I can see your name.
Hi,
she-
guys. I'm sorry. I am on the call. I'm actually on 2 calls at one time. So I'm getting little pieces of everything. Corey, what was it you wanted me to share about our project?
The question is about looking at public-private partnerships for employer transportation. And I thought talking about what you're working on there in Waycross might be appropriate.
Sure. Yeah. My name is Elena. I work with Action Pack. We're a private nonprofit, and our administrative office is based in Ware County. And we're working right now. We've got some planning funding back about a year and a half ago initially with Federal Transit to really just kind of see how can you make some additional things happen transportation wise in your community. So we've been working on that, and along with Corey and Megan and some local city and county individuals and some employers and some school individuals, because really we've been focusing on students and or people trying to get to work has been our focus. So what we really narrowed it down to is something that hopefully, once we could get it in place, would complement the existing services, would just add additional seats really to what's already here. And right now we're talking with the community, the technical college here and the state college to establish some routes for some test runs with their student population from, if there's a larger neighborhood, we could really designate that maybe has some higher student counts or things of that nature to move from a fixed location to the campus. And the 2 campuses here are within about half a mile of each other. So you could really get both campuses with one. We're also talking with a couple of the industrial park employers really to establish something similar. If there's a fixed route that could run at 2 points in the day or maybe 3 points in the day from certain residential areas, or fixed points that would just serve a pocket of 2 or 3 employers, or that would just serve those 2 educational institutions, and then bringing in them investment wise, since it's going to be serving their population and helping with their retention.
Awesome. Elena, thank you so much for that information. That's really helpful because this is a topic that we're hearing across the state, is that there's more workforce transportation needs than what 5311 or the public transit can do alone, especially during daytime hours where a lot of their vehicles are being filled up through DHS passengers and leaves little room or seats for workforce transportation. And some of the things that you're working on have specifically been mentioned about working with technical colleges and state colleges and providing transportation for apprenticeships and young people entering the workforce, like ages 16 to 18, who plan to enter the workforce as soon as they graduate high school, providing them the transportation to get to internships or apprenticeships. So your programs are very interesting. We may be reaching out for some additional information on how you set that up, because that may be, a model that we want to use in the recommendations.
A couple of things that, as she was talking, made me think about. We actually were also awarded funds this year through the U.S. Department of Agriculture to look at employer-based van pools in our region and setting those up. But those would also focus on concentrated employers where the transit service doesn't, our hours of service don't meet their needs. It's kind of the way to say it. we are operating 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. essentially, and if they have a shift that doesn't fit in that time window, it doesn't help them. So that was an area that we were going to look at there. And then a program that we just worked on this week. It's not really our program. It's actually going to be Wild Adventures theme park program.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to encourage their employees to purchase trips just as a regular public rider on our service.
Mm-hmm.
And then Wild Adventures is going to reimburse the employee for the full cost of that trip. We might be talking later about a more formal program, but we're kind of starting this small and letting Wild Adventures kind of run with it and fund their employee transportation that way.
That's great.
And that will be announced later this week.
That's awesome. Well, congratulations on that. That's a big kind of project to get set up and organized. So nice job.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Sorry,
Elena.
it's Elena again. When that all kind of goes public and everything's really set up for that, I'd love to see the kind of fee schedule they're looking at for that. If it's the full reimbursement for the ride cost, or if it's a portion, or how that looks, that could help us.
Right now, Wild Adventures is looking at reimbursing. From my understanding, they're going to reimburse their employees the full cost of the fare. Of course, the fare does not cover the full cost of the trip in most cases for transportation. So they're just going to be public riders because we aren't sure how many riders they're going to have. It might lead to a more formal discussion between Wild Adventures and us to discuss a future rate for a larger number of riders, but we don't know what that's going to be. But yeah, we'll definitely be tracking this as to see how that goes, and we can follow up.
Okay, awesome. So I have another set of questions just regarding coordinated service. Southern Georgia, y'all are fairly recently coordinated. I know it has been a lot of work to get to where you are. I guess my main question is, what are some lessons learned, or what would you tell some other regions who are thinking about organizing a coordinated service based on your experience?
That's a really good question. I'll leave it. If there's anybody else out there that wants to chime in, I don't need to be the only one talking about it. Gosh.
You can look at these other ones, like maybe there were some specific barriers or challenges, or maybe you had really high hopes of, getting this up and running in like a year, but it took you, 3 or 4 years, and it's because of, you ran into this or that, or, whatever it is.
Yeah. Well, we started, I think, this discussion, gosh, probably back in 2018, when we really started the regional discussion. We were kind of gearing up to begin services in fiscal year 21, but COVID happened and the money picture did not look good early on when we had to make the decision whether we were going to move forward or not. But I would say if anybody else is going to do this, they need to make sure that they really evaluate their finances, that they have identified how they're going to match federal transit revenue with either it's fares, whether it's local government funds, or whether it's purchase of service revenue from other coordinated services. Really making sure they evaluate that very carefully. I think having experienced operators doing the day-to-day operations helps. I don't know that we would be in the same situation if we were trying to set this up brand new on our own. That I think helped tremendously, having an organization like MIDS Transportation to come in and really know how to do the day-to-day stuff, work with the drivers, work with the clients, dispatching, routing, all that kind of stuff. Another thing would be keeping the communication channels open between all of the state agency partners, whether that's Gdot, Department of Human Services, or Department of Community Health. We have learned that having those conversations often, giving somebody a call when you have even the smallest question, helps a lot. That we can be clear on where you're all going, and that you aren't, I'll say, violating any federal rules, since there are so many we have to follow. That really helps, just keeping those communication channels open.
Okay. Y'all kind of took a go big or go home approach with your coordinated system, and y'all have several counties in there. I think you're right. Having experienced operators probably helps with that transition. But looking back, if you were to talk to other regions, would you suggest, phasing in a coordinated system and starting out small and just building as you can, or, hit the ground running? This is probably your best chance to get as many counties in, go for it.
Well, okay, so we started with, there's 18 counties in our region, 3 counties are not participating, so we're down to 15. 11 of those 15 provided services already, at a county level basis. So we essentially took over those county services, which helped a lot, that we were just kind of keeping the status quo going. In a couple of communities where we took over their service that they were operating, I think a big challenge was a shift from the customer perspective. We had a couple of issues early on what phone number to call, maybe some driver changes, things like that, and routing changes that occurred because we were trying to integrate that individual county into a larger regional system. But those issues, I think, got worked out pretty quickly and easily. For us, it was the go big or go home kind of method that we had to go with, was because of the economies of scale of the region. We needed the size to be able to make the financial part of it work.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anybody else have any comments on the coordinated system that you'd like to bring up? Questions? I just have a couple other questions for everybody, and you don't have to answer all of these. I think the number one question that I'm most interested in is the last one. And if you were given $1 million for transportation services, where would you prioritize that spending? Where would you put it? And it doesn't matter what the source is. I'm not saying it's coming from the federal. I'm saying maybe you just need more help with your local match. Maybe it's to pay your drivers more. Maybe it's to pay rising insurance costs. That's one that we heard this week. So if you were given $1 million, where would you spend that money? Maybe it's outfitting more of your vehicles with wheelchair lifts. I think we have a caller.
This is Marshall Ingram.
Hi.
Hey there. And so with that $1 million, and I want to back up with these 3 counties that we don't have transportation in Lanier, Clinch, and Echoes. That's where I would put it right there. If it's nothing but buses, where I know Corey was talking about the cost, but buses, and you can get more people on there and possibly bring the cost down to go to Valdosta, to Waycross, or even Tifton, to jobs, to colleges, to schools, to the hospital, to stores, shopping stores, food stores, and that's where I would put it. And I'm wondering if there's any buses in the system now instead of vans or SUVs. Are there any buses in the system now? Maybe Corey can answer that. Thank you.
The Southern Georgia Regional Transit, we only have 12 passenger cutaway vans. The city of Valdosta operates minivans on their system.
So perhaps if we had larger vehicles, you could reduce the per rider trip cost.
Especially in those 3 counties, because it's so high now, you get more people on buses, and so you go into this area at this time, and they can just, schedule themselves, If the bus will pick me up, or the bus will drop me off, and, my doctor's appointment is at 2, and I can get there at 12, it might be a waiting time, but, when you're way out in Lanier or Clinch or Echoes, you're just gonna have to do the best you can.
Yeah, and maybe that money, depending on where it's coming from, which, like I said, there's no specific source of this funding. Not necessarily to purchase bigger vehicles to reduce the cost, but maybe another strategy is being able to find a way to subsidize those rides a little bit more to lower the cost to the rider.
Yes.
Okay. Who else? How would you spend $1 million? I think people not speaking says that they would just keep it for themselves.
One area, and I'm going to it doesn't really apply to necessarily these questions. Maybe you could use the $1 million to help do this, but earlier you asked about gaps in service or other services that we had not mentioned, and I hadn't even thought about it, but Valdosta State University operates their own transit system, currently independent of everyone else. But I think there is an opportunity, especially with the City of Valdosta on-demand system, to really have a conversation with the university as to how to coordinate those 2 services in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I feel like Athens Transit and University of Georgia have a similar kind of arrangement where Athens Transit provides free trips to UGA students. And then I think the UGA has some sort of agreement where they provide some sort of service as a partnership with Athens. So it's not just like a one-way partnership.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Thank you. Megan, were you going to say something? I saw you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I just think that there are a lot of opportunities for the $1 million. Obviously, the driver salaries could be supplemented or increased in order to incentivize that position, because I know that with our third-party operator, they have many that will start, they'll see what the job entails, and then they'll kind of quickly back away, because I think that they realize that there's so much required in this job physically, as far as a personality type, a caretaker, essentially, while they're in their immediate time frame with them. They're kind of scared away in a way. So I think that if we could incentivize the drivers, I think if we could make the job essentially worth their while, that they would be more enticed to do it, it would kind of maybe even help investing in training for, they already take so much training for safety standards and to make sure that they can ensure that the ride is safe. But maybe to give them, I don't really even know, maybe development skills to make them better suited for the job.
Yeah,
in a
maybe
way.
some of those soft skills.
Right.
Yeah.
You know how some jobs, when you're doing onboarding, you may take a personality test to see how you fit in a certain position. And maybe if they have some kind of resources like that, they can kind of get that out of the way up front,
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Megan. I appreciate it. I muted myself. Anyone else want to chime in on these questions? You're still going to have an opportunity to provide follow-up questions and comments after this workshop. We're going to be taking those until March 4th, and Matthew has more information about that. But I'm going to turn it back over to him since it's 3:16 and finish out the presentation. And then, yeah, we can still take a few more questions before the end of our time.
Thank you so much, Kirsten, and thank you everybody for the dialogue and for the information today. It's really important for this plan. As you see our schedule one more time, we're working on the existing conditions assessment. The information we discussed today is going to go into that assessment, so it's going to be part of the plan and part of the meeting summary as well. So we're also working on the alternatives analysis and developing the draft final report in the coming months. We're targeting July for publishing the draft final report on our website for that public comment review period. Once again, I want to say thank you so much for your participation in today's workshop. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me or to Kirsten with any questions or comments on the information we shared today. Also, if you have not completed the survey, please do so. Whether you are a provider of RHST services or rider on those services, we want to hear from you. If you're on the phone, you can find the surveys at www.dot.ga.gov/transit. And my email is mawilson@dot.ga.gov. We ask that you send any questions or comments by March 4th, so we have time to respond and note them for the meeting summary. Again, thank you all so much for your time this afternoon, and have a great day.
Yep, and before you leave, a recording of this presentation will be available on the website as well as the slides. They should be posted before the end of this week. Okay, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate the input.
Thank
Good
you
to
for
see
your
you.
time.